Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Samuel Adams Returns. Yes, those anti-federalists did get it correct. This is Tom Navolis, your host, and this week I'm going to take and really bend your minds as to what we've just seen again happen in Congress, what we're seeing happen in the administration. We're seeing that the Uniparty came together to secure Speaker Johnson in his position as Speaker of the House. Mike Johnson is retained as the Speaker, and what we saw was a coalition of Democrats who we knew were going to do such, as well as the establishment Republicans in doing the same. This week I'm calling the program Treachery in Treaties, and better to liken to Jehoshaphat. Now, you're wondering what that's going to be about, but let's take a real look at this, because here's where I want you to start out, and we're going to talk about initially, because what we have going on in the way that the budgets are being put together, the way the money is being spent, the way that our gas stoves are being gone after. You know that, right? That all of your different means of cooking as well as heating your home are being gone after vis-a-vis treaties, vis-a-vis agreements, vis-a-vis international agreements, which I talk about in detail in my book, but I'm going to bring you into some of that in today's program. Now, when I'm talking about treacheries in treaties is evidenced in the reading through the State Department's, and here's a link to it there at the website, Treaties in Force. And then they also have a supplemental that's called the 2021 to 2023 supplemental, which is made up of 86 pages of treaties that are either renewed or brand new. So you have 86 pages of treaties just between 2021 and 2023 in the supplemental. Now, in the full Treaties in Force, there's 570 pages of treaties. In my book, I give you more detail as to what those treaties are comprised of to some extent. But one of the things that's important is that you're not going to find all the detail of what I'm going to be talking about at and in the newsletter like I usually do. I just haven't had time this week. We've got so much going on here with Peppers for Fun, the business, that I just have not had a lot of time to write a lot. And to the extent most of you don't even bother to read it. You know, I can tell that through the newsletters that I send out, how many actually click or go to the website through the newsletter. Maybe you go later, but through the newsletter that I send out, you don't go to the details at samueladamsreturns.net to look at all the various references. But today, I did put the treaty in force as well as the supplemental links right there in the first paragraph, so you can go to those if you so choose to do that. So why are the links so important? Why are those links so important? Because, listen very closely, because the treaties in force and those supplemental, being the total treaties in force, are the law of the land. What? I can hear you screaming, what? Obviously, you do not understand the federal Constitution and its effects fully enforced. Yep, there is treachery in treaties and how they're set up and we're going to get into it. But first off, you have to understand why they are the law of the land. Article 6 of the United States Constitution, Clause 2. This Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. Now, there's a large argument, and I have in there where you can go look at the definition under Webster's 1828 dictionary as to the use of notwithstanding. And then we'll see how Joseph Story in particular looks at this clause from an application perspective, even with the context of notwithstanding. Now, one of the things you need to understand with this is that the treaties in force do not, let me start that again, do not include all of the UN treaties and agreements that are wrapped into that large agreement. The UN treaty is something that stands all unto itself, the UN agreement, and it is the law of the land. Everything that happens at the UN that then we become party to as international agreements, and I cover that in my book as well as all of the executive international agreements, such as what happened with George Bush signing on to Agenda 21 and then Clinton later funding it, which I cover in other programs. But yes, these agreements and the UN treaty make us subjects to it. And yes, I use subjects. And here's Webster's definition of subjects out of his 1828 dictionary as a noun. One that owes allegiance to the sovereign and is governed by his laws. We're going to touch on that based on oath. And then from a verb perspective, to bring under the power or dominion of. So we're slaves to these treaties. We're subjects, therefore. And when you swear, which I have done, and this is where I know I have blown the minds of many military purists that have taken the oath to defend the Constitution from enemies, domestic and foreign, is the reality that you're also taking that oath to defend the Constitution in its totality, including Article 6, Clause 2. Article 6, Clause 2. Which also means that all of these treaties are wrapped in as the supreme law of the land, and we take an oath to defend all of that. Now, I've taken that oath, and I've said that, with clear conscience. And even after understanding the details of Article 6, I take it in a way that hopefully I'll cover in another program someday as to why a biblical Reformed Christian can take that oath in good conscience before God and not be morally, biblically sinning, be wrong. We'll cover that another time. But what I want to say here on this Article 6, Clause 2, the shoe fits. It fits. These treaties are the supreme law of the land, and we are subject to them And as the latter portion of the clause says, the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. So there's a much more that can be said on this at a later point in time, but I do want you to go to the newsletter that I sent out and look at the link for that definition of what it is on notwithstanding, and ponder that. Now I want to walk us into the next aspect of this, where this is really going to bend your mind, especially those that are substantive constitutionalists that want that purity of what the Constitution is supposed to mean and original intent, so on and so forth. Myself being very much bent in that direction. But we have to go back to the several other programs that I have recently done in relationship to covenant, to understanding what that is and covenanting, what government does, who is in particular the sovereign. Under the Articles of Confederation, the states, with the citizens within those states, were fully and completely the sovereigns. And I have to confess that until I started reading this particular book that I'm going to be talking about and introducing you to in this segment and into the next, I had that common sense that we use that term, we the people, being the sovereign. But that is not necessarily true. The intent that was manipulated from how the preamble was originally structured, delineating each individual state as the parties to the Constitution, to making it we the people, to which Patrick Henry came unglued about. He came unglued. I've mentioned in other programs where Patrick Henry asked the question, who gave you, meaning that convention, the right to put in we the people instead of all the various states? And we're going to talk about that because that is absolutely so significant. Patrick Henry clearly understood the distinction of a republic and the confederation of that republic. And to the next point, to which we're going to discuss in the conspiracy in Philadelphia, is that Patrick Henry, being more Reformation-minded in his religious beliefs, may have had that inner inkling that by changing that wording from that arrangement of the various states into we the people, the God in that covenant and the structure of who now is the sovereign completely changes. Completely changes. I'm not going to get into every detail of the conspiracy in Philadelphia. I came across this book that was written in 2004 by Dr. Gary North, which is only the third part of his book, Political Polytheism, The Myth of Neutrality. And we're going to come back and we're going to dig into this more in the next segment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. And we're going to dig into the conspiracy in Philadelphia. This shorter book written by Dr. Gary North, it was updated from part 3 of Political Theism, The Myth of Neutrality, which was originally written in 1989, really covers through the concept of covenant in government, in governance, and what is that covenantal relationship specific to the U.S. Constitution. So with that, I'm going to move us into this idea and thought process and bring out a couple of the real key factors in relationship to treaty and how they end up being a true debacle. But just in the preface is all we're going to be able to touch on in relationship to this book. There is so much documentation from other authors that Dr. North brings together to really show, and I've spoken of it before because many of you know that I'm favorite the Articles of Confederation. I favorite those Articles of Confederation with some of the Maryland Convention necessities of changing its mechanisms, but the idea of confederation versus the Constitution was something that I have always been more akin to, if you will. But what we look at is that the whole idea of this convention changes the very concept of sovereignty. You have to have a sovereign someplace for people to have that perspective on what does it mean to rule. Now, one of the key points that Dr. North starts out with in his preface is the fact that a good portion of these folks that went to the convention were Unitarians. And they actually, by being Unitarians, had that very different perspective as to then who was God? How did authority come into play? How did, in particular, sovereignty function in the relationship between that sovereign over all of the universe and then mankind itself? So in this very beginning on this book, he outlines several of the key players: John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. Then he looks at Benjamin Franklin in the perspective of religion. And then there goes into an argument on the critics of his thesis is that if what you say is true, then good Christian men who attended the Constitutional Convention were deceived by the men who called together the convention. Now, with that, I want to take and refer you back to the program where I had saying that this Congress that we have right now in play with Speaker Johnson is the most Christian Congress there is. And I think I took you through the thought process to understand it's not. And it's to the same point that Dr. North brings out here. And I didn't start really reading this book until just this past week. So my conclusions in relationship to all that is happening in Congress and with Speaker Johnson in his so-called Christianity and not governing under God's guidance is exactly what Dr. North brings up here. In his conclusion, and this admission does not satisfy the critics. So you're saying that there was a hardcore group of conspirators who actually deceived the other attendees. And Dr. North pretty much is saying, but how could you say this terrible thing, or they're talking about him, his critics are talking about him, about our founding fathers. On this basis, the convention was assembled under false pretenses. Now, I've said that for years. All attendees took a vow of lifetime silence. They held their meetings on the second floor, no caves droppers. The press was barred from attending. The legislature's instructions were deliberately violated. So this is something that a Jack Rakove studies on the Continental Congress, an organization which committed suicide in September 1787. And he puts it, this author as well as historians put it, for the most remarkable aspect of the convention's 4-month inquiry was that it was conducted in virtual absolute secrecy, uninfluenced by external pressures of any kind. No detailed instructions bound the delegates to specific goals, nor did the convention even feel constrained to confine itself to proposing mere revisions of the articles, as some of the members' credentials stipulated. No crowds assembled in the streets outside to shout for redress of grievances or to protest a decision to meet behind closed doors, except for occasional rumors, many of them inaccurate, that American newspapers published. The general public knew nothing of the convention's deliberations. There's so much in here that just in this preface alone that you have to really understand that there was a change in the whole thinking of how we would function from a perspective in now what we call political science. So when this assembly came in, they basically trashed the Articles of Confederation. There's a few bits and pieces that are woven in there, but if you really look at it in totality, pressure was put on eventually on the Congress under the Articles of Confederation to virtually vote against themselves. So what occurred then was something in this change of sovereignty is that under the Articles of Confederation, we were actually functioning as a republic. Many independent states, nation states, if you actually wanted to look at it, very much like you could say in Europe, but under those Articles of Confederation, they all went back to the actual sovereignty registered in the state legislatures, elected representatives as the constituencies being the ultimate and total sovereign of their property, their community, and their states. That all changed. So this one professor by the name of Burgess went on to observe that the public in 1787 did not understand what was going on. Of course, the mass of the people were not at all able to analyze the real character of this procedure, being that constitutional convention. And this is still true today. The primary victims of the convention, Bible-believing Christians, come to the defense of the Constitution whenever they believe it's under attack. But what was really under attack, however, it deprived Congress and the legislatures of all freedom of action by invoking the plebiscite. And the plebiscite being that they couldn't vote against it. It thus placed those bodies under the necessary of affronting the source of their own existence unless they yielded unconditionally to the demands of the convention. The convention's proposal of plebiscite proved to be politically irresistible. Congress refused to challenge the convention's deliberate overturning of Congress' own authority and also the rules governing and amending the process that were specific in the Articles of Confederation. Instead, in September 28, 1787, Congress passed along copies of the proposed Constitution to the state legislatures, which in turn, and here's a key point, which in turn authorized the calling of state ratification conventions that would be completely independent of state legislatures, thereby transferring legislatures and the sovereignty of the states to the convention. Why do you think Sam Adams did not attend the convention? He didn't go. He understood this concept, this principle. And when I get into his readings, I was sitting there going, why were you against, Sam? Why were you against the Constitution? What were the fundamental components of what you read without having any understanding of what was happening in the convention itself? Because you remember, they vowed, those in the convention took a vow, they took an oath to stay silent for the rest of their lives. Madison and Adams and a few others, Madison in particular, released his notes just before he died. But we're going to talk a little bit more about how George Washington saw this, excuse me, in this consolidation, in this sovereignty shift. So thereby what happened here is that Congress and the state legislators had allowed the better organized Federalists to replace the existing national Constitution in the name of the people. So the conspirators in Philadelphia, and above all George Washington, provided them with this justification. He was a main source of the conspiracy's legitimacy. Now, people wonder about that. Well, now you're hitting on George Washington, Tom. No, I'm going to read you a letter here from George Washington that to me was shocking. I was shocked by it, and it is in the context of the first component of what Dr. North gets as I focus back on treaties as we move into the third segment. But Washington starts out, and I'm going to take you through that in a minute, but Washington starts out with, "We have now the honor to submit to the consideration of the United States in Congress assembled that Constitution which has appeared to us most advisable. The friends of our country have long seen and desired," now the friends of our country have long seen and desired that the power of making war, peace, and treaties, that of levying money and regulating commerce, and the correspondent executive and judicial authorities should be fully and effectually vested in the general government of the Union. But the impropriety of delegating such extensive trust to one body of men is evident. Hence results the necessity of a different organization. Now that's how George Washington starts this out. Now I'm going to leave you hanging with that as we consider and move into the next segment. And in that next segment, I will come back into something in the rationale that Justice Story said about Article 6, Section 2. Come on back for the next segment, because Sam Adams will be returning. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this last segment, and I'm going to pick up immediately where I left you hanging in that last segment. And if you didn't get the last segment, I highly recommend that you go listen to it, because it's not in the blog post for SamuelAdamsReturns.net. And you have to get the book, The Conspiracy in Philadelphia. So George Washington, as I mentioned, he sets this all up, that the power of making war, peace, and treaties needs to be regulating money, regulating commerce, judicial authority, needs to be in a general government. But he continues on here, which I think is the telling components that are missed as to what I was talking about, that shift in sovereignty from the people. And as I argued, exactly what our red-headed friend Patrick Henry saw is that this was a shift of sovereignty away from the states into a consolidated government by the misrepresentation in the preamble of the U.S. Constitution from the delineation of each state to a shorter concept of we the people. Washington continues this: it is obviously impracticable in the federal government of these states to secure all rights of independent sovereignty to each, and yet provide for the interests and safety of all. Now pay attention. This is really important what Washington writes right here. Individuals entering into society must give up a share of liberty to preserve the rest. The magnitude of the sacrifice must depend as well on situation and circumstance as on the object to be obtained. It is at all times difficult to draw the precision, the line between those rights which must be surrendered and those which may be reserved. And on the present occasion, this difficulty was increased by a difference among the several states as to their situation, extent, habits, and particular interest. He goes on. In all our deliberations on this subject, we kept steadily in our view that which appears to us the greatest interest of every true American, the consolidation of our Union, in which is involved our prosperity, felicity, safety, perhaps our national existence. The important consideration, seriously and deeply impressed on our minds, led each state in the convention to be less rigid on points of inferior magnitude than might have been otherwise expected, and thus the Constitution which we now present is the result of a spirit of amity and of that mutual deference and concessions which the peculiarity of our political situations render indispensable. That it will meet the full and entire approbation of every state is not perhaps to be expected, but each will doubtless consider that had her interest been alone consulted, the consequence might have been particularly disagreeable or injurious to others, that it is liable to as few exceptions as could reasonably have been expected. We hope and believe that it may promote the lasting welfare that country so dear to us all, and secure her freedom and happiness in our most ardent wishes. Now, when Monroe wrote, the Anti-Federalists finally concluded after their defeat to fight this Constitution. James Monroe wrote to Jefferson in 1788, the prospect of Washington as president had ruined their chances. He told Jefferson, be assured his influence carried the government. So much here on what has happened, that this was a procedural revolution that occurred. They violated everything that was intended. And what they put together then is this coming together under this personal authority of George Washington, political, irresistible invocation of the invisible people as the new sovereign God of the nation. This new sovereign announced the Constitution would be represented in history by delegates to future state ratifying conventions rather than by elected representatives to existing state legislatures. And this is in Article 7. This new doctrine of representation investiture was the central dogma of the Revolution of 1787-88, from which the new nation subsequently derived its legitimacy. This dogma constituted both a theological and a political revolution. That to me, that was it was mind-blowing as I'm going through this. And then he takes and he goes into his update on political polytheism, the myth of pluralism, in which it starts to go through this Constitution is a covenant, but this covenant is made in such a manner that it is not even with the state legislatures. It has been driven down to the people. But in doing so, do the people really have any mechanism and authority in representation? And the bottom line at this point in time is no, we don't. Not when you have one representative for over 1 million people, 800,000 to 1 million people, depending on the size of the state. We have no representation. This federal government is self-sustaining and on its own roll, using us as what I defined earlier as the slaves to fund the mechanisms of those that have come into consolidation and relationship with the government. Boy, this is just an amazing, mind-blowing book, if you will, in how the Constitution now is taking and replaced our sovereignty under this whole different thought process, and in relationship to what does that mean when we once again look at treaties. So let me take you to the idea of treaties as I was looking at it with Justice Story. And what he was talking about, Joseph Story, he comes in here very strongly in talking about this particular Article 6, Clause 2, and that the propriety of the clause would seem to result from the very nature of the Constitution, because it was established as a national government, and that national government should have all that power and rights to be supreme. And if you don't have that supremacy, then it cannot effectually carry out all that it needs to carry out. And then a law, by the very meaning of them, includes supremacy. It is a rule to whom it is prescribed are bound to observe. So as we look at the results from every political association, individuals enter into a state of society, now this is almost exact words as what George Washington said, the laws of that society must be the supreme regulator of their conduct. If a number of political societies enter into a larger political society, the laws which the latter may enact pursuant to the powers entrusted to them by the Constitution must then be the supreme over those societies. So he's talking about the states joining in on the Constitution, then it must be that. Now, he goes on to say here, it would otherwise be mere treaty, dependent upon the good faith of the parties and not a government, which is only another name for political power and supremacy. So he defines government as that being a name for political power and supremacy. And we see that played out all the time, every day. We just saw that power play happen by taking and holding up Mike Johnson as the Speaker of the House. It now is a consolidated government of the uniparty all the way through the Biden administration. So then the merely acts otherwise would be is that of usurpation. And how does that work? He comes on to that. Now he gets into the regards of treaties. There is equal reason why they should be held when made to be the supreme law of the land. And he goes through this whole rationale on it. It is to be considered that treaties constitute solemn compacts of binding obligation among nations, and unless they are scrupulously obeyed and enforced, no foreign nation would consent to negotiation with us. Now, we know treaties are broken all the time. The communists broke treaties. I mean, there's documentation out the kazoo. We have treaties being broken right now. We hold to the treaties, but other nations like Iran and all of the others break the treaties. So where's this all going? There's more for you to read there, but what I wanted to do is take you real quick through the treachery in the treaties, and I want to take you into this idea of Jehoshaphat and where it was with 2nd Chronicles, and starting in 2nd Chronicles 16 through 20. There you go, Tom, we're getting into this now, into this biblical preachy side of it. I'm not getting into any biblical preachy side of anything because, as I always tell you, everything in government has religion and theology tied to it. And the fact even is that I was amazed that that in his book, Gary North actually quotes from Meredith G. Klein, who I do, on the structure of biblical authority in relationship to not only the 10 Commandments, but to the Constitution, and that it is all covenantal. So with that, just to hurry along, because we only have a little bit more than a minute, you have to understand that Asa, at that time, he brought gold and treasuries and to Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, and he wanted him to fight against Israel because Israel was building things on his border. So he entered into a treaty with Baasha, king of Israel, entered into that treaty, and so he went in, the king Asa, and he sent his armies in and started beating the snot out of his enemies. And then what happened was that at that time, Hanai, the seer, came to Asa, king of Judah, and said, look, he says, because you've relied on the king of Syria, you have not relied on the Lord your God. Therefore, the army of the king of Syria has escaped your hand. And then he goes on to say, for the Lord runs to and fro throughout the whole earth, shows himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is loyal to him. In this you have done foolishly, therefore now you shall have wars. And he did. So what about Jehoshaphat? Where does that come in? There's a summary there at SamuelAdamsReturns.net that I'm not going to be able to get into. But you have to understand what Jehoshaphat did first and foremost is that he sent out teachers to teach the law of God throughout the whole land, and then the enemies feared them. Sam Adams understood that principle. We don't do that any longer. Come on back next week.